Still, my phone vibrated in my palm as the realtor said my son had already listed my house. As I turned the screen face down, the vibration kept humming, patient, like it had time. While he read the signature aloud, that buzz pressed harder, drowning out his apology. The same vibration followed me through memories of teaching my boy how to sign his name. That's when I realized this wasn't a sale. It was my own family deciding I was finished. Still feeling the phone hum, I chose not to shout. I chose to make the paper tell the truth. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please, like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Still, my phone vibrated in my palm as the realtor said my son had already listed my house. As I turned the screen face down, the vibration kept humming, patient, like it had time. While he read the signature aloud, that buzz pressed harder, drowning out his apology. The same vibration followed me through memories of teaching my boy how to sign his name. That's when I realized this wasn't a sale. It was my own family deciding I was finished. Still feeling the phone hum, I chose not to shout. I chose to make the paper tell the truth. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Walter Mercer kept his mornings simple on purpose. In Phoenix, the day didn't start with sunrise so much as it started with the promise of heat, and he liked to get ahead of it. Coffee finished, mind settled, yard handled before the neighborhood turned noisy. At 69, he didn't need much to feel steady. A hose, a patch of green, the faint, clean smell of damp soil before the sun burned it back to dust. He stood at the edge of his front walk, watering the front plants Ruth had picked years ago, because she believed a house should look lived in, not merely owned. Walt had kept them alive since she passed, partly for her, partly because routine was a kind of quiet dignity. The water made small, dark circles at the roots, spreading with patient logic. That was the world Walt understood cause and effect. Proof you could see. His phone lit up against his thigh. He paused the spray and reached into his pocket, squinting at the screen. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. But something about the timing too early, too direct, made him answer. "Hello," he said, voice even. A man's breath came through the line first, as if he'd been bracing himself. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. My name is Elliot Park. I'm a realtor." The words were professional, but the tone carried an edge of discomfort. The way people sound when they're holding a door open for bad news. "I'm calling about a property listed under your name." Walt looked out at the street. Same quiet cul-de-sac, same parked cars. Nothing moved except a palm frond shifting in a weak breeze. "You've got the wrong person," he said. "I don't think I do, sir." Elliot didn't push, but he didn't retreat either. "Before I go any further, I need to ask you something directly. Did you approve this sale?" The question didn't belong in Walt's morning. It was too sharp, too specific. For a second, he assumed it was a scam with a new costume, the kind that preyed on older voices and public records. "What sale?" he asked, already leaning toward hanging up. There was a faint rustle, paper moving, like Elliot was looking at something in front of him. "The property at..." He read the address clearly without stumbling. "Is that yours?" Walt's thumb tightened on the phone. His eyes tracked to his front door, the brass handle catching a glint of light. "That's my home," he said. "Yes, sir. That's why I'm calling." Elliot's politeness stayed in place, but the unease underneath it grew. "Our file lists the seller as Walter J. Mercer. We received a signed authorization already submitted with the listing packet." Walt felt his body go still in a way his mind didn't approve of. He'd spent a career fixing systems where one wrong input could wreck an entire output. This felt like that one incorrect line that changed everything downstream. He tried to keep his voice neutral. "Read that again." "The seller name?" Elliot asked. "The signature," Walt said. "Read the signature line out loud." On the other end, Elliot hesitated. Not long, but long enough for Walt to hear what it meant. This is going to be awkward. Paper shifted again, closer to the receiver, as if Elliot had lifted it. "Okay," Elliot said. "Slow now. It's signed as Walter J. Mercer." Walt swallowed once. The letter shouldn't have mattered, not to anyone who didn't know him. But Walt knew his own name, the way he knew his own wiring. He'd been Walter R. Mercer since the day he was born. The middle initial had followed him through military forms, engineering licenses, mortgages, marriage certificates, and his wife's headstone paperwork. He hadn't used J in his life, not once. He kept his face calm, but something inside him turned cold and precise. "What else is on that page?" he asked. "An authorization to list," Elliot said, cautious now. "And a statement that you've reviewed the terms. It looks standard." "Standard," Walt repeated, tasting the word like it didn't belong. He stared at the wet soil by the lantana, watching the water soak in as if nothing in the world had changed. His heart wasn't pounding. That would have been easier. What he felt was a tightening, an alert, an engineer's attention snapping into place. "I didn't sign anything," Walt said. "And I didn't authorize a sale." Elliot's voice softened, like he'd been hoping Walt would say the opposite. "That's what I needed to confirm, sir." Walt drew one slow breath, then another, careful not to give panic any room to grow. If someone had filed paperwork in his name, they hadn't made a mistake. They'd made a decision. He listened to the faint sound of Elliot waiting, unsure what to do next. Walt didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply anchored himself to the one thing he trusted, the details. "Read the signature again," Walt said, calm as a lock clicking shut, slowly, already feeling the ground shift under him. Walter Mercer didn't turn the hose back on after the call ended. He stood there for a full minute, phone still warm in his hand, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood like it might offer an explanation. Nothing did. The street looked the same. His house stood where it always had. But something had been touched without his permission, and he could feel it the way a man feels when a lock has been tested. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. Walt moved with purpose, not panic. Panic wasted time. He went straight to the spare bedroom where he kept his records metal filing cabinet against the wall. Labels written years ago in block letters that never slanted. He slid open the top drawer and pulled out the folder marked property. The weight of paper was reassuring. Deed, title insurance, mortgage payoff letter from years back. He laid everything out on the bed with the same care he used when troubleshooting a circuit board. Next came his personal folder driver's license, passport, trust paperwork, copies of his will, proof of existence, proof of continuity. He took out his driver's license first and held it up to the window light. Walter R. Mercer. The R sat there plainly, as it always had. He checked the deed next. Same thing. Trust documents. Same. Not once, in 6 decades of forms, had anyone gotten that initial wrong. Not banks, not the VA, not the county. Walt sat on the edge of the bed and let that settle. Whoever filled out the sale authorization didn't guess. They chose J. He picked up his phone and called Elliot back before doubt could creep in and soften the edges. "Mr. Park," Walt said when Elliot answered, "I've checked my documents. I never signed anything related to a sale. Not digitally, not in person, not ever." Elliot exhaled like he'd been holding air since their first call. "Thank you for confirming. I needed that on record." "Who submitted the paperwork?" Walt asked. There was a pause, heavier than before. "It was delivered to our office by your son," Elliot said carefully. "Caleb Mercer. He said he was acting on behalf of the family." The words landed low in Walt's stomach. Not sharp, not explosive, just heavy, like something sinking where it shouldn't. His son's face rose uninvited in his mind. The easy smile, the practiced confidence, the way Caleb talked fast when he wanted to stay ahead of questions. "Caleb," Walt repeated. "Yes, sir." He seemed prepared. "Had copies of your ID. Said you preferred not to handle the details yourself." Walt closed his eyes for a brief second. Caleb had helped him with paperwork before. HOA disputes, online forms, scanning documents when Walt's printer jammed. Caleb knew the difference between J and R. He joked about it once years ago, calling it Dad's stubborn old-school thing. "Did he say why he was handling it?" Walt asked. "He said you'd discuss downsizing," Elliot replied. "That it was time." Walt opened his eyes and stared at the neat spread of documents on the bed. Downsizing wasn't a word he'd used since Ruth died, and even then it had been a passing thought, not a plan. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's all for now." When the call ended, the room felt smaller. Not threatening, just unfamiliar. Walt gathered the papers back into their folders with deliberate care, as if restoring order could push back what he was feeling. The betrayal hadn't fully formed yet. It was still a question mark shaped like his son. He needed a second voice, someone who wouldn't minimize this or rush him into anger. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped Hannah's number. She answered on the second ring, breathless, like she'd stepped away from something important. "Dad?" "Hannah," Walt said, steady. "Something's wrong." He explained without dramatics. Realtor call, sale authorization, the wrong initial, Caleb delivering paperwork. He could hear Hannah go silent on the other end, the way she did when she was processing instead of reacting. "That's not a mistake," she said finally. "No," Walt agreed. There was a beat. Then her voice softened but sharpened at the edges. "Dad, listen to me. Don't confront them yet. Not Caleb, not Sabrina. Not until you know exactly what they've filed and where." Walt looked down at his hands, still calm, still steady. He felt the shift fully now, not fear, but awareness. Someone had moved pieces on a board he thought was untouched. "I won't," he said. "Good," Hannah replied. "Because once you confront them, they'll know you're onto it. And whatever they've done so far, that might not be all of it." Walter Mercer didn't like meetings called to clear things up. In his experience, that phrase was usually code for someone hoping confusion would do their work for them. Still, when Elliott Park asked him to come by the title company in person, Walt agreed without hesitation. If paperwork had been used against him, paperwork was where he'd meet it. The building sat off a wide arterial road, beige and forgettable, designed to blend into the Phoenix sprawl the way mistakes often did. Walt arrived 10 minutes early and sat in his car for a moment, watching people go in and out with folders tucked under their arms. No one looked nervous enough. That bothered him. Inside, the air was over-conditioned and smelled faintly of toner. Elliott met him in the lobby with a tight, apologetic smile and led him toward a small conference room. Walt noticed the way Elliott avoided eye contact, like a man already aware he'd stepped into something deeper than a routine transaction. The title officer was already seated when they entered, a woman in her 40s with neat hair and a tablet in front of her. On the table lay a manila folder, thick, its edges squared, too squared. "We just want to make sure everything's aligned," she said pleasantly, "before anything escalates." Walt took the seat across from her and set his hands on the table, palms down. He didn't speak yet. He looked at the folder. "That's the purchase contract," Elliott said, following his gaze. "It was drafted in anticipation." "In anticipation of what?" Walt asked. The title officer glanced at Elliott, then back to Walt. "Of closing, assuming the authorization stood." Walt felt a flicker of heat move through his chest. Someone hadn't waited for clarity. Someone had assumed momentum would carry them past resistance. He leaned back slightly. "I didn't authorize anything," he said. "You know that." "Yes," she replied carefully. "Which is why we need to address the power of attorney on file." The words landed hard enough to crack his composure for the first time. "The what?" "Power of attorney," she repeated, tapping her tablet. "It grants signing authority to act on behalf of the seller. It's included in the packet we received." Walt's calm fractured. Just for a second. He felt it physically, like a misstep on a stair you expected to be solid. "I've never signed a power of attorney," he said. "For anyone." The title officer nodded, as if she'd expected that response too. "That's why we're here." "May I see it?" Walt asked. She hesitated. The pause was brief, but telling, the kind that revealed policy wrestling with instinct. "Normally we don't." "I'd like to see every document tied to my name," Walt said evenly. Elliott cleared his throat. "I think that's reasonable." The title officer exhaled once, then reached into the folder. She slid several pages across the table, aligning them with unnecessary precision. Walt didn't touch them immediately. He looked at the top page first, scanning from a distance. Seller name, address, the wrong middle initial again. He picked it up and read slowly, methodically, the way he'd taught junior engineers to read schematics, never assuming intent, only observing facts. When he reached the power of attorney, his jaw tightened. The signature line held his name, written with careful imitation, close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough to fail scrutiny. Below it sat a notary stamp, faint and slightly smeared, like it had been scanned more than once. The seal wasn't crisp. The date looked compressed, the witness line half-filled, no printed name. Walt set the page down. "This isn't valid," he said quietly. The title officer didn't argue, That's what we need to determine. Who notarized it? Walt asked. She checked the page. A mobile notary. Out of Mesa. Walt nodded once. He felt the anger now, but it stayed contained, disciplined. Anger didn't help if it announced itself too early. I'd like copies of everything, he said. All submissions. All timestamps. She hesitated again, longer this time. I'll need approval. Elliot leaned forward. Please, he said, given the circumstances. The copies were made. Walt watched the machine pull the pages through, one by one. Each sheet another confirmation that this wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate. When the stack was placed in front of him, he gathered it carefully, aligning the edges, keeping his movements calm. I won't be moving forward with anything, Walt said, standing. And I'll be consulting counsel. Of course, the title officer replied. Walt didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone in the room. He walked out with the papers tucked under his arm, his face composed. But by the time he reached his car, the plan had already begun to take shape. He would let them believe he was confused, slow, overwhelmed by process. And while they underestimated him, he would move faster than they ever expected. Attorney Denise Harrow didn't waste time on pleasantries. Her office was quiet, orderly, and sharp around the edges, like her. Framed degrees on the wall, no family photos, the kind of place where feelings were acknowledged only if they affected outcomes. Walt appreciated that immediately. Denise read in silence for several minutes, flipping through the copies Walt brought from the title company. She didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't frown. She just read. Walt sat across from her, hands folded, watching her eyes move the way he once watched oscilloscopes, tracking signals most people never noticed. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm but decisive. This power of attorney isn't just questionable, she said. It's very likely forged. Walt didn't react outwardly. Inside, something hardened. Why? She turned the document around and pointed. First, the notary stamp. It's been scanned and reinserted, not applied directly. Second, the witness line is incomplete, which alone is a problem. But the real issue is the signature. She pulled another page from the stack and slid it beside the POA. This signature wasn't written for this document. It was lifted. Lifted, Walt repeated. Yes, Denise said. Digitally copied from an older form and dropped here. See the compression artifacts? The edges don't match the paper texture. She flipped to another document. Walt recognized instantly an old HOA dispute form from years back. His stomach tightened before she even said it. This, Denise continued, tapping the page, is where the signature came from. Walt felt the betrayal fully then, sharp and undeniable. Caleb had helped him with that HOA mess. Printed forms, scanned documents. Caleb had sat at this very kitchen table and joked about bureaucrats while Walt signed where he was told. He had access, Walt said quietly. Denise nodded. Enough access. She turned back to her computer and began typing with quick, efficient keystrokes. I pulled preliminary county data before you arrived. There's a recording attempt queued. Walt looked up. When? Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. The room seemed to narrow, not claustrophobic, but focused. Walt saw the sequence clearly now, like a schematic snapping into alignment. Record the forged POA. Finalize authority. Push the sale through fast. Control the story afterward. They'd say it was for my own good, Walt said. That I agreed. That I forgot. Yes, Denise replied. That narrative shows up often in these cases, especially when family is involved. Walt leaned back in the chair, grief surfacing beneath the anger. Not for the house, for the assumption. They hadn't asked. They hadn't trusted him to say no. They'd simply decided he was an obstacle to work around. Denise stopped typing and met his eyes. Here's what we do next. Immediately. She outlined it without drama. An emergency notice contesting authority. Written objection sent to the title company and escrow. A formal fraud alert attached to the property record. Time-stamped. Documented. Unignorable. Once this is filed, she said, any attempt to record tomorrow will trigger review. It won't slip through quietly. Do it, Walt said. She nodded and began drafting, fingers moving fast now. The printer whirred to life beside her desk, spitting out pages that felt heavier than paper. Proof. Resistance. A line drawn where none had existed yesterday. As Denise worked, Walt stared at the window overlooking the parking lot. Cars moved in and out, ordinary lives passing by. Somewhere, Caleb was probably convincing himself this would all smooth over, that his father would grumble, forgive, and comply. Denise slid the final page toward him. "Sign here. This confirms you contest all authority granted under that POA." Walt signed with his full name. Slowly, clearly, the R deliberate. When he finished, Denise gathered the documents into a neat stack. "I'll send this within the hour," she said, "and notify the title company in writing." Walt stood, feeling steadier than he had since the first call. The anger was there, yes. The grief, too. But above both sat resolve, quiet, immovable. Denise looked at him once more. "Some clients want to confront family immediately." Walt shook his head. "I don't want to yell," he said, voice low and firm. "I want to win." Denise gave a small, approving nod. "Then you're doing exactly the right thing." The response was immediate, but not loud. That was what struck Walt most. Once Denise sent the paperwork, there were no sirens, no confrontations, no dramatic phone calls. Just a series of confirmations landing quietly in his inbox, like doors, locking one by one. Denise filed the legal freeze request before noon. By early afternoon, the escrow team acknowledged receipt of a formal fraud warning tied to the property. The language was precise and firm, written to leave no room for interpretation. Any attempt to move the sale forward would now trigger review, delay, and documentation. Momentum, the thing Caleb had been counting on, was gone. Walt read the emails twice, then once more. He didn't smile. Relief felt premature. Instead, he felt a controlled stillness settle in, the way a circuit goes quiet when power is cut deliberately, not accidentally. At home, he turned his attention inward, not emotionally, practically. He sat at his desk and began changing passwords. Email first, banking next, retirement accounts, utilities, cloud storage. Anywhere his name existed alongside numbers or permissions, he tightened access. He enabled alerts that buzzed his phone for any login attempt, any transfer, any change. The process took longer than he expected, not because it was difficult, but because he realized how much trust he'd extended over the years without thinking about it. When he finished, he leaned back and let the chair creak under his weight. The house was quiet in that familiar, echoing way it had been since Ruth passed. He'd always thought of the silence as loneliness. Today, it felt like control. The knock at the door came just after dusk. Walt frowned, checked the peephole, then opened it to find Hannah standing there with a carry-on bag and eyes that were already glossy with anger she was trying not to show. "You didn't tell me you were flying in," he said. She stepped forward and hugged him hard, tighter than usual. "You didn't tell me how bad it was." They sat at the kitchen table with mugs of untouched coffee between them. Walt explained what Denise had done, what the freeze meant, what had been secured and what hadn't yet. Hannah listened without interrupting, jaw clenched, foot tapping lightly against the chair rung. "They really thought this would slide," she said finally. Walt nodded. "That's the part that bothers me." Hannah looked at him. "Not the money, not the house," Walt said. "The assumption. They assumed I wouldn't notice, that I'd be confused, or tired, or grateful they handled it." He shook his head once. "I'm not scared. I'm insulted." Hannah exhaled sharply. "They're gambling," she said, "because they think you'll forgive them, that you'll smooth it over to keep the family intact." The word family hung between them, heavier than it used to be. The next morning, Walt met Denise again. Hannah came along, silent but observant. Together, they assembled what Denise called a clean packet: deeds, driver's license, trust paperwork, a page highlighting the middle initial discrepancy, prior signatures across decades, consistent, unmistakable. Each document was labeled, copied, and ordered. No emotion, just evidence. "This is your spine," Denise said, tapping the stack. "If anyone pushes, this holds you upright." Walt appreciated the phrasing. It felt accurate. As they wrapped up, Denise looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "They may reach out," she said, "or escalate, or try to explain." Walt considered that. He thought of Caleb's voice, practiced and persuasive, Sabrina's careful framing, the stories they'd already begun telling. "I'll meet with Caleb," Walt said finally. Hannah stiffened. "Dad." "Not to argue," Walt added. "Not to accuse, just to listen." Denise nodded slowly. "Listening can be powerful," she said. If you don't give anything back. Walt gathered the packet and stood. He felt steady again, anchored by preparation rather than hope. Somewhere ahead was a conversation that would change things permanently. He didn't know exactly what Caleb would say, but for the first time, Walt wasn't walking into it unarmed. Caleb chose Sunday on purpose. Walt knew that the moment the invitation came through casual tone, careful warmth, the kind of message meant to feel like tradition instead of strategy. Dinner at our place, just family. Walt accepted without hesitation. Listening required proximity. The house smelled of roasted chicken and something sweet when Walt arrived, the familiar sensory performance of care. Caleb greeted him at the door with a grin too quick to be natural, clapping him on the shoulder like a teammate instead of a son greeting his father. Sabrina followed, smile practiced, eyes already measuring. "Dad, you look good," Caleb said. "Really good." Walt nodded and stepped inside. Compliments were currency. He didn't spend them. Dinner unfolded with the rhythm of something rehearsed. Plates passed. Glasses filled. Sabrina led most of the conversation, steering it smoothly toward the future, like she'd been waiting for an opening. "It's honestly a smart move," she said for the third time, cutting into her chicken. "Downsizing now while the market's hot? You'll thank us later." Walt chewed slowly. The community we found is perfect," she continued. "Quiet, well managed, people your age." "My age," Walt repeated mildly. "Yes," she said, unfazed. "Active, but not overwhelming. You'll love it." Walt set his fork down. "Where is it?" Caleb answered too fast. "Not far." "How far?" Walt asked. They exchanged a glance quick, practiced. Sabrina smiled. "We can show you brochures once things are finalized." "Finalized," Walt said, "before I know where I'm living?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, waving a hand like Walt had asked about paint color. "We'll figure it out, Dad." The phrase landed wrong. Not cruel, careless. Like he was talking about storage, not shelter. Walt nodded once, filing it away. They ate a few more bites in relative quiet. Then Walt spoke again, tone casual, almost absent-minded. "By the way, I noticed something odd on the paperwork." Sabrina's fork paused mid-air. "The signature," Walt continued. "Middle initials wrong." Caleb blinked. "What?" "It says J," Walt said. "Mine's R." Sabrina recovered first. "Oh, that's nothing," she said lightly. "Those forms autofill weird sometimes." Walt watched her eyes as she spoke. They flickered not with fear, but calculation. Caleb cleared his throat. "Yeah, it's probably just a clerical thing." "Probably," Walt agreed. Caleb leaned forward, voice lowering, shifting gears. "Actually, that's why I wanted to talk tonight. To keep things moving, we might need you to sign a fresh version, just to clean it up." Walt tilted his head slightly. "A fresh version of what?" "The authorization," Caleb said. "So there aren't delays. Buyers get nervous." Sabrina nodded, stacking reassurance on top of pressure. "It's just procedural. Happens all the time." Walt smiled, then not wide, not warm. Mild. Controlled. "I'll let my attorney review it." The room changed instantly, not dramatically subtly, like someone had adjusted the air pressure. Caleb's smile stiffened. "Attorney?" "Of course," Walt said. "Big decisions." Sabrina laughed, a fraction too loud. "Dad? That seems unnecessary." "Does it?" Walt asked. Caleb's voice sharpened. "We're trying to help you." "I know," Walt said. "That's why I'll have counsel look at it." Silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable. Sabrina broke it first. "You don't trust us?" Walt met her gaze. "Trust isn't the issue." "Then what is?" Caleb asked. Walt wiped his mouth with a napkin, movements unhurried. "Clarity." Caleb pushed his chair back slightly. "We're running out of time on this." Walt stood. "Then it's good I didn't rush." He thanked them for dinner and let himself out. The night air cooler than expected. As he walked to his car, he felt it clearly now, not doubt, not confusion. Pressure. They weren't asking anymore. They were closing. Behind him, through the window, he saw them still seated at the table, heads bent together, voices low. Walt drove away knowing one thing for certain. Whatever move they made next wouldn't be polite. Walter Mercer had been inside government buildings his entire life, but the Maricopa County Recorder's Office carried a particular weight. It wasn't dramatic or imposing, just fluorescent lights, muted voices, and the quiet authority of records that didn't care how anyone felt. Facts lived here. Walt trusted that. Hannah walked beside him, phone already in her hand, eyes alert. She hadn't said much on the drive over, but Walt could feel her anger like static. Not wild or unfocused aimed. They checked in and waited until their number flashed. A clerk waved them forward, a man in his 30s with tired eyes, and a name badge that read Luis Ortega. His voice was polite, practiced. "How can I help you today?" Walt explained simply. Property. Possible unauthorized filings. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He just asked to see the chain. Luis's posture shifted almost immediately. Not defensive, attentive. "Let me pull that up," he said, turning to his screen. They watched as he navigated through records. Walt knew well enough to recognize by structure if not detail. Deed history scrolled by. Dates, transfers. Nothing out of place until the recent activity log. Luis slowed. "Okay," he said carefully. "Here's your original deed. Clean. No issues." He clicked again. "And here are the recent e-recording attempts." Walt leaned in. Hannah did too. "There's a pending quitclaim upload," Luis continued. "Not recorded yet. Still in queue." Walt felt Hannah's breath hitch. "Quitclaim," she repeated. "Yes," Luis said. "It would transfer interest quickly, assuming authority holds." "Who submitted it?" Walt asked. Luis pulled up another screen. Third-party filing service. He turned the monitor slightly so they could see. Walt read the uploader name slowly. It wasn't a person. It was an LLC. Generic. Forgettable. Designed not to stand out. "That's not me," Walt said. Luis nodded. "Didn't think so." He clicked again, pulling metadata. "The LLC is registered locally. Mailbox address." Hannah's jaw tightened. "So not impulsive," she said quietly. "This is structured." Luis glanced at her, then back to Walt. Whoever did this knew the system well enough to move fast, but not cleanly. Walt absorbed that. Fast but sloppy. Confident but careless. He recognized the pattern. "Can I get copies?" Walt asked. "Certified." "Yes," Luis replied. "And timestamp logs?" He paused, then added, "Given the situation, that's smart." While Luis worked, Hannah moved around the counter, photographing the screen when permitted, capturing file names, dates, reference numbers. Her hands were steady. This wasn't panic. It was documentation. Luis returned with a small stack of papers, stamped and clipped. He slid them across the counter like something heavier than paper. "These show every attempted submission, the uploader, and the timing." Walt flipped through them slowly. Each page confirmed what his instincts already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a sequence. "How soon would that quitclaim have gone through?" Hannah asked. "If authority wasn't contested," Luis said. "Soon. Possibly same day." Walt closed his eyes for a brief second. Record. Transfer. Sell. Explain later. He opened them again. "Thank you," he said. "You've been very helpful." Luis gave a small, knowing nod. "I see a lot of things here," he said. "This one's familiar." As they walked out, the desert sun hit them hard, the brightness almost aggressive after the office's dull calm. Hannah exhaled sharply. "They were going to strip it clean," she said, "not just sell." Walt looked down at the folder in his hands, the certified copies, the logs, the evidence layered neatly together. He felt no satisfaction, only clarity. "Yes," he said. "And now we know exactly how." They reached the car. Walt placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat, as if it were something fragile and dangerous at the same time. This was no longer about suspicion or instinct. It was about proof. And now, he had enough of it to bury a lie. The shift was subtle at first. Walt noticed it in the way people lingered longer at their mailboxes when he stepped outside, how conversations paused when he walked past. Then the questions started, wrapped in politeness sharp enough to cut. "Are you moving, Walt?" Mrs. Gibbons from across the street asked one morning, hand shading her eyes. "Someone said you're looking at assisted living." Walt smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I'm not." She looked embarrassed, but not surprised. "Oh, well, that's good," she replied, already retreating. By the end of the week, it wasn't just neighbors. The guy at the cafe asked if he was doing okay. The woman who walked her dog past his house every evening mentioned she'd heard he was making a big change. None of them said where they'd heard it. They didn't need to. Stories like that didn't drift. They were released. Hannah showed him the social media post that night. Sabrina's account, carefully curated, as always, neutral tones, soft lighting, a photo of clasped hands. The caption was worse than an accusation because it pretended to be concern. "Hard family decisions aren't easy," it read. "But sometimes love means stepping in to keep Dad safe, even when he doesn't see it yet." No names, no specifics. Just enough to let people fill in the blanks. Walt read it twice, then handed the phone back. He felt anger rise, but it was a controlled burn, not a flare. "That's deliberate," he said. Hannah nodded. "They're setting the stage." The call came an hour later. Hannah put it on speaker without asking. Caleb's voice came through tight and accusatory. "What did you tell him?" he demanded. "I didn't tell him anything," Hannah replied. "I listened." "You turned him against us," Caleb snapped. "He's lawyered up now." Walt sat quietly at the table, hands folded, listening to his son talk like a man already cornered. "You're poisoning him," Caleb continued. "Dad doesn't even understand what's happening." Hannah's voice hardened. "He understands exactly what's happening. That's the problem." Caleb hung up without saying goodbye. Walt stared at the dark screen, grief threading through the anger now. Not grief for what they'd done, but for how easily they'd decided who he was allowed to be in their story. Confused, fragile, grateful for intervention. It made the theft sound like care. "They're building a narrative," Walt said quietly. "So when the truth comes out, people won't believe it." Hannah reached for his hand. "Or they'll say it was necessary." The next morning, Walt met Denise again. He showed her the post, described the calls, the rumors. Denise didn't look surprised. "That's common," she said. "Control the perception before the facts surface." "What do I do?" Walt asked. "Document everything," Denise replied. "Screenshots, dates, names, and respond to nothing publicly." "Not yet." Walt frowned slightly. "Yet." Denise met his gaze. "The person who panics first loses leverage. Let them talk." That afternoon, Walt sat in his living room with Hannah holding his phone. The camera was steady. The light was even. No drama. Just him, centered in the frame. "My name is Walter R. Mercer," he said calmly. "I am 69 years old. I am of sound mind. I have not authorized the sale of my home, nor have I signed any power of attorney granting someone else that authority." He paused between sentences, letting each one stand on its own. "Any claims otherwise are false," he continued. "This statement is being recorded to document the truth." He stopped recording and handed the phone back. Hannah's eyes were wet, but proud. "That was perfect," she said. Walt nodded. He didn't feel brave. He felt prepared. Over the next few days, the noise continued. Another vague post, another neighbor's sideways glance, another relative's cautious text asking if he was okay. Walt answered none of it. He watered his plants. He drank his coffee. He reviewed documents with Denise and organized evidence into neat, labeled folders. He watched the timing closely, noting when posts appeared, when calls came, when silence followed. Someone was getting nervous. He could feel it in the pacing of their moves. And Walt waited, knowing that the next step wouldn't come from strength. It would come from panic. Denise's call came just after 10 in the morning. Walt recognized the tone before she finished the first sentence. Tight, clipped, urgent in a way she hadn't used yet. "They're moving," she said. "The buyers have already wired the funds. Closing is scheduled for today." Walt felt the air leave his lungs, slowly. Not in panic, but in recognition. This was the shove, the gamble. Everything pushed onto one square of time. "I thought the freeze," Hannah started, already standing. "It's contested," Denise said, "not invisible. They're trying to force it through before legal review catches up." "Where?" Walt asked. "The title company. Same office." "I'll be there," Walt said, already reaching for his keys. By the time they arrived, the parking lot was half full. Walt noticed that immediately. Too busy for a quiet weekday morning. Inside, the atmosphere felt wrong, voices hushed, movement sharp, the low tension of something being rushed. They were led straight to the conference room. Caleb was already seated at the table. He sat in the seller's chair, shoulders squared, one arm draped casually over the back like he belonged there. He looked up and smiled, relieved and irritated at the same time. The expression of a man who thought he'd beaten the clock but resented the witnesses. Sabrina sat beside him, posture composed. In her hands was a thin folder. Walt recognized it instantly. Photocopied ID peeking out. The corner of his driver's license unmistakable. On top lay a single-page letter, cream-colored, formal. A medical note, Denise murmured under her breath. Stress. Related incapacity. Walt felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. The title officer entered with a polite, brittle smile. "We're just about to begin," she said, then hesitated as Denise stepped forward. "Before you do," Denise said calmly, "we need to address authority." She placed her documents on the table with deliberate care. Certified copies, county timestamps, the emergency contest notice, proof of name, discrepancy, front and center. "This sale is unauthorized," Denise continued. "My client is present, competent, and contests any power of attorney presented here." The room froze. The title officer scanned the top page, then the next. Her expression changed. Not dramatic, just serious. "One moment," she said, standing. "I need to call legal." Caleb shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "We're already funded. You can't just stop." "Yes, we can," the title officer replied, already halfway out the door. The silence she left behind was thick and unstable. Sabrina spoke first, voice controlled. "Walt, you're under a lot of stress. We were trying to protect you." "By using my ID?" Walt asked quietly. Caleb rounded on him. "You didn't even want to deal with this stuff." "We handled it." "You handled my name wrong," Walt said. Caleb's face flushed. "You're embarrassing me," he said, voice rising. "In front of everyone. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" Walt looked at his son, really looked at him, and felt the last traces of doubt drain away. This wasn't desperation anymore. It was entitlement colliding with resistance. "You ruined the deal," Caleb shouted. "You waited until the last second just to make a point." Walt didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He stayed seated, hands folded, eyes steady. "You ruined it," Walt said quietly, "when you signed a name that wasn't mine." Caleb stared at him, mouth open, the words landing too cleanly to deflect. The title officer returned with another woman on speakerphone. "We're suspending the signing," she announced. "Effective immediately. This transaction is paused pending investigation." Sabrina's grip tightened on the folder. The medical letter slid halfway out, its authority evaporating in real time. Caleb laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "This is unbelievable." "No," Walt said. "This is documented." The title officer gathered the papers, separating Denise's certified packet from Sabrina's folder with clear intent. "We'll be filing an internal fraud report," she added, "and notifying escrow." The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes, no closing smiles. As they walked out, Walt felt the weight of the moment, not triumph, not relief, exposure, the kind that couldn't be undone. Behind them, voices rose, urgent and angry, already arguing over blame. Walt didn't turn around. He knew now. This wasn't over, but it had finally stopped being quiet. The call came from the title company before Walt even made it home. Their voice was formal now, stripped of pleasantries. An internal fraud report had been filed. Given the documents presented and the attempted closing, the matter was being referred to authorities. Walt listened without interrupting, hands steady on the steering wheel. This was the point where things crossed from family disaster into public record. Once that line was crossed, there was no quiet way back. 2 days later, Detective Paige Collins sat across from him at a small interview table in a municipal office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. She was in her early 40s, posture relaxed, but eyes precise. The kind of calm that came from having seen enough chaos to stop reacting to surface noise. "Mr. Mercer," she said, clicking a pen once, "I'm going to ask you questions directly. If anything isn't clear, stop me." Walt nodded. "I prefer that." Hannah sat beside him, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't argued when he asked her to come. She just showed up, ready. Walt laid out his materials one stack at a time. Driver's license, deed, trust paperwork. He pointed out the middle initial discrepancy without commentary. Then he placed the signature comparisons side by side, the authentic ones, steady and consistent, and the copied version, flattened and imperfect. Finally, the timestamp logs from the recorder's office, and the cued filing attempts. Detective Collins studied everything carefully, asking questions only when something needed precision. Dates, access, who handled which documents, and when. Walt answered evenly, keeping emotion out of the facts. "This power of attorney," Collins said finally, tapping the page, "was used to assert control over a significant asset without your consent." "Yes," Walt said. "And the signature was digitally lifted?" "That's what my attorney confirmed." Collins leaned back slightly. "That qualifies as forgery. Given the value of the property and the attempted transaction, this could rise to felony-level fraud." The word felony landed heavier than Walt expected, not because it shocked him, but because it attached a weight to his son's actions that felt irreversible. He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of the fine tremor he'd been ignoring. Hannah spoke up immediately. "We want to press charges." Walt turned toward her, surprised by how firm her voice sounded. "Hannah, they tried to steal your house," she said, eyes bright with restrained anger. "They tried to erase you." Detective Collins watched the exchange without interruption. When Walt didn't respond, she spoke again, voice level but unmistakably serious. "Mr. Mercer, I need to be clear with you. If no action is taken, patterns like this tend to repeat." Walt looked up. "Repeat?" "Yes," Collins said, "and often more aggressively. Once someone believes they almost succeeded, they adjust. They don't stop." Silence stretched across the table. Walt felt grief press in not loud, not dramatic, but heavy and personal. He thought of Caleb as a boy, proudly signing his name on a library card, of teaching him to write carefully, to get details right, because details mattered. He hadn't taught him this. "I never wanted this," Walt said quietly. Collins nodded. "Most people don't. But wanting it and allowing it are different things." Hannah reached for his arm. "Dad, if you let this go, they'll tell themselves they were justified." Walt closed his eyes for a moment. He saw the path clearly now. Not justice as punishment, but as boundary. A line that said, "This stops here." He opened his eyes and met Detective Collins' gaze. "What happens if I proceed?" "We open a formal investigation," Collins said. "We request records, subpoena filings, interview involved parties. You'll be protected from further attempts during that process." Walt exhaled slowly. The grief didn't vanish. It settled into something firmer, resolve shaped by loss, not anger. "Proceed," he said. Detective Collins nodded once and clicked her pen shut. "All right, we'll take it from here." As they stood to leave, Hannah squeezed his hand. Relief and sorrow tangled together. Walt felt the weight of what he'd just agreed to, but also the clarity. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be built on silence. And for the first time since this began, Walt knew exactly who was about to panic next. Caleb didn't come to the house this time. He called first, voice stripped of its confidence, and asked if they could have a word somewhere quiet. Walt chose a public cafe near the retirement community neutral ground. Witnesses nearby. No leverage disguised as hospitality. Caleb arrived early and stood when Walt approached the table, hands already shaking. He looked smaller than Walt remembered, shoulders rounded, eyes darting like he was tracking exits. "Dad," he said quickly, sitting back down. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't bad." Walt waited. "They're coming after me," Caleb continued, words tumbling out. "Collectors. Lawsuits. I'm buried. I just needed time. And the house." He swallowed. "It was supposed to buy me time." Walt studied his son's face, the desperation finally unmasked. "You could have told me," he said. Caleb shook his head hard. "You would have said no." The honesty stung more than the lie. Walt nodded once. "So you decided to steal it instead." Caleb flinched. "I didn't think of it like that." Walt leaned forward slightly. "That's the problem." Sabrina didn't beg. She arrived later that afternoon, unannounced, standing on Walt's porch with a posture that suggested grievance rather than guilt. She didn't sit when invited in. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "We're a family." "You used my identity," Walt replied. "That's not family." She crossed her arms. "We did what we had to do. Survival isn't pretty." "Survival," Walt repeated. "For whom?" "For us," she said, as if it were obvious. "We've supported you for years. You owe us some understanding." The entitlement was naked now, stripped of softness. Walt felt anger rise, but it didn't control him. It clarified him. "I owe you honesty," he said. "Nothing else." That evening, Denise sent over drafts. Formal language. No emotion. A cease and desist ordering them to stop all filings, communications with third parties, and representations of authority. A restraining notice barring any attempt to record documents tied to Walt's name or property. Walt signed and sent them back without hesitation. Next came the quiet work. He called the utility companies and removed shared access. He updated mailing permissions, redirected sensitive correspondence, locked down online portals one by one, bank accounts, insurance. Anything that still assumed family meant trust. Each click felt less like loss and more like repair. When Sabrina returned days later, it wasn't to plead, it was to threaten. "You know," she said coolly, standing in the doorway, "guardianship exists for situations like this. Confusion, stress, decline." Walt looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the calculation behind the concern. "You could try," she added softly. Walt didn't raise his voice. "Try it," he said, "and you'll explain it to a judge." Her smile faltered for the first time. The house felt different after she left. Quieter, but not hollow. Walt sat alone at the kitchen table, documents neatly stacked, boundaries drawn in ink instead of hope. They'd made their move, he'd answered. What remained was escalation, and Walt knew exactly who would blink first. Denise filed the lawsuit on a Tuesday morning, early enough that the courthouse website still lagged under light traffic. The complaint was clean and direct, an action to quiet title, invalidate the forged power of attorney, and permanently bar any future claims of authority derived from it. No adjectives, no moral arguments, just facts stacked in the right order until denial became impossible. Walt read the filing once, then again. Seeing his name in bold at the top plaintiff, Walter R. Mercer, felt grounding. This wasn't retaliation, it was correction. A system being reset to factory truth. That afternoon, Denise walked him through the next layer of protection. The house would be moved into a revised trust structure, one designed not for convenience, but for resistance. Amendments would require independent verification. Successor trustees would be clearly defined. No casual help, no shortcuts disguised as care. "It makes things slower," Denise said. "But safer." Walt nodded. "Slow is fine." The transfer paperwork was executed with ceremonial care. Every initial deliberate, every signature unmistakable. Walt felt a strange calm as the final page was notarized, this time in person. Ink pressed firmly into paper. Witnesses identified and recorded. The house hadn't changed, but its defenses had. Hannah brought the next discovery 2 days later. She didn't lead with anger. She laid the evidence out on the table the way her father had taught her chronologically. "The filing service," she said, pointing to a receipt. "It was paid with Caleb's business card." Walt leaned in. The name of the service matched what Luis Ortega had shown them at the recorder's office. The charge date aligned with the earliest unauthorized submissions. "He wasn't just helping," Hannah continued. "He was funding it." Walt sat back, the realization settling with a dull finality. Caleb's business had been a vague topic for years, always on the blogs. Formatting B777. Verge of a breakthrough. Always one contract away from stability. Walt had stopped asking detailed questions when the answers never solidified. Denise pulled financial summaries tied to public records, missed payments, short-term loans, vendor disputes. A slow bleed masked as momentum. "He was running out of options," Denise said. Walt closed his eyes briefly. The picture was complete now. Not desperation in a moment, but erosion over time. A man convincing himself that one decisive act would fix everything. "I don't want him destroyed," Walt said quietly. "I want this stopped." Denise studied him. "You're asking for restitution and accountability." "Yes," Walt replied. "Not cruelty." She nodded once. "Then we lead with a settlement offer." The terms were drafted carefully. Repayment of all legal and administrative costs. A written admission of unauthorized action. Permanent protective stipulations barring any future filings, representations, or access. Compliance would pause prosecution. Refusal would accelerate it. "It gives them a door," Denise said. "But it's narrow." Walt understood. Accountability always felt narrow to people used to shortcuts. The offer was sent electronically and by certified mail, time-stamped. Unavoidable. Walt didn't wait by the phone. He returned to routine coffee, yard work, the quiet maintenance of a life that refused to be reduced to a cautionary tale. But beneath the calm, he felt the tension humming. This was the moment where character asserted itself. "They'll refuse," Walt said to Hannah that evening. "Why are you so sure?" she asked. He looked at her, a sad half-smile touching his face. "Because pride always does first." The sun dipped behind the houses, shadows lengthening across the lawn. Somewhere, Caleb and Sabrina were reading the offer, weighing consequence against ego, accountability against control. Walt stood in the quiet, knowing the next response wouldn't be reasonable. It would be revealing. Denise's office was chosen deliberately. Neutral ground. No family photos, no memories to weaponize. Just glass, wood, and law. Walt sent the invitation himself, brief, factual, impossible to misread. Meeting regarding the property. Counseled present. Caleb and Sabrina arrived together, 10 minutes late. Sabrina had dressed for effect. Soft colors, minimal makeup. Hair pulled back just enough to suggest strain. She clutched a tissue she hadn't needed yet. Caleb looked sharper pressed shirt, jaw set, confidence worn like armor that hadn't been tested in daylight. Walt was already seated when they entered. He stood, nodded once, and sat again. No hugs, no greetings beyond that. Denise closed the door behind them and took her place at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming," she said evenly. "We'll keep this focused." Sabrina exhaled shakily as if bracing herself. "I just want to say, before this turns into something ugly, that everything we did was out of love." Denise didn't respond. She slid a folder across the table instead. "This meeting," Denise said, "is about facts." She began without preamble. The forged power of attorney. The blurred notary stamp. The incomplete witness line. Each issue was stated cleanly, without commentary. She followed with the ID misuse photocopies submitted without consent, attached to filings asserting authority. Caleb shifted in his chair. Denise continued. County logs appeared next, printed and highlighted. Timestamps. Uploader IDs. The Shell LLC. The pending quitclaim attempt. She placed the signature comparison, last authentic signatures, aligned beside the copied one. Caleb leaned forward now, eyes fixed on the paper. The confidence drained from his face in stages, like color receding under harsh light. "That's not," he started. Denise held up a hand. "This isn't a debate. These documents are certified." Sabrina finally spoke, voice trembling on cue. "You're making him sound like a criminal." "I'm describing actions," Denise replied. "The law does the rest." Sabrina turned to Walt then, eyes wet. "You've always been controlling," she said. "This is just another way to punish us for not doing things your way." Walt felt the familiar ache behind his ribs, the old instinct to explain, to soften, to keep the peace. He didn't indulge it. "Control is not theft," he said calmly. "This was theft." The word landed harder than shouting would have. Caleb looked up sharply. "Dad, you signed my name wrong," Walt continued. "You filed authority you didn't have. You tried to move my home without telling me where I'd live afterward." Sabrina shook her head. "We were trying to protect you." "By lying?" Walt asked. "By telling people I was confused?" Silence pressed in. Caleb swallowed. His hands were shaking now, visible on the tabletop. Denise slid one final document forward. "You've received our settlement offer. Repay costs. Admit unauthorized action. Sign protective stipulations. Or we proceed." Caleb stared at the page like it might bite him. "This is insane," he said weakly. Sabrina stood abruptly. "You want to destroy your own family." Walt rose slowly. "I want the truth acknowledged." Sabrina's composure cracked then, irritation breaking through the tears. "You've always needed control." Walt met her gaze steady. "No, I need my name back." Denise opened the door. "You're free to go. Your counsel can contact mine." Caleb hesitated, looking at Walt as if searching for an opening that no longer existed. Then he followed Sabrina out, anger trailing behind them like heat. The door closed softly. Walt remained standing for a moment, breathing evenly. Denise watched him, then nodded once. "They're angry," she said. "Yes," Walt replied. "That means it landed." Walt looked at the empty chairs across from him. He felt no victory, only certainty. The truth had been spoken aloud, in a room that recorded consequences. And whatever came next would no longer be confused for misunderstanding. Detective Collins didn't call with small talk. When Walt saw her name on the screen, he answered immediately. "We traced the LLC," she said. "It leads to a mailbox store off Camelback." Walt closed his eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. A mailbox store wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. "Who's it registered to?" he asked. "A man named Victor Alvarez," Collins replied. "He's Sabrina's cousin." The line went quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that meant the next part mattered more. Walt felt Hannah's hand tighten on his arm as she listened in. "We brought him in this morning," Collins continued. "He didn't last long." "What did he say?" Walt asked. "That Sabrina paid him to set it up," Collins said. "Cash at first, then small transfers. He thought it was just for paperwork." Walt felt something inside him go cold, not sharp, not explosive, precise. Sabrina hadn't acted alone or impulsively. She'd outsourced, planned, created distance. "There's more," Collins said. Walt braced himself. "The filing service attached to that LLC wasn't only used for the house," she explained. "We found multiple attempted submissions, credit applications, account inquiries, all tied to your name." Hannah sucked in a breath. "How many?" "Enough to show a pattern," Collins said. "This wasn't a single move. It was a campaign." Walt leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The house sale had been the visible piece, the anchor asset. But underneath it had been something broader, something more invasive. Control of property, control of credit, control of identity. "She wasn't fixing a problem," Walt said quietly. "She was taking everything." "Yes," Collins replied. "A full financial takeover." The word takeover echoed. It stripped away any remaining illusion of good intentions. This wasn't family misjudgment. It was strategy. Later that afternoon, Caleb called. His voice sounded hollow now, stripped of bravado and anger alike. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something." Walt didn't interrupt. "I knew about the sale," Caleb admitted. "The house, I mean. I thought that was it. I swear." Walt closed his eyes again. He could picture his son pacing, hands running through his hair, searching for language that would soften the truth. "I didn't know about the credit stuff," Caleb continued. "Or the LLC. Sabrina said it was just to make things clean." Walt waited, letting the silence do its work. I thought once the house sold, everything would calm down," Caleb said. "I didn't ask questions. I didn't want answered. There it was. Not innocence, convenience." Walt felt the colder truth crystallize, solid and undeniable. Caleb hadn't protected him not because he was fooled, but because he stood to gain. The benefit had mattered more than the risk to his father. "You knew enough," Walt said. Caleb didn't deny it. "I needed it," he said, voice breaking. "I needed it to work." Walt felt grief press against his ribs, not loud, not dramatic. The quiet grief of seeing your child clearly, without the softening blur of hope. Detective Collins called back that evening to confirm next steps. "Given the scope," she said, "we're moving forward on all counts. Fraud, identity misuse, attempted financial exploitation." She paused. "I need your authorization for full cooperation." Walt looked around his living room. The same furniture, the same walls, the same house they'd tried to erase him from piece by piece. "You have it," he said. "No limitations?" Collins asked. "No," Walt replied. "Proceed fully." When the call ended, Hannah sat beside him, eyes wet but steady. "Are you okay?" she asked. Walt nodded slowly. "I am now." He understood it completely at last. This hadn't been about helping him, or saving him, or even desperation alone. It had been about control and who got to decide when his life ended, and theirs began. That clarity didn't bring comfort. It brought resolve. And once the truth reached this depth, there was no turning back. The notice reached Sabrina on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered by a process server who didn't care about her tone or her posture. It was formal, unmistakable, and heavy with consequence. An active investigation. Identity misuse. Attempted financial exploitation. Words that didn't bend to image. The collapse wasn't loud. That was what Walt heard later from people who'd known her longer than he had. Her voice tightened. Her social ease evaporated. Invitations were declined instead of curated. The confident framing she'd once mastered no longer held. Authority had shifted, and she could feel it. Caleb felt it differently. The buyers pulled out within hours of the investigation becoming known to the title company. Funds reversed. Escrow closed. The deal he'd been leaning on like a crutch vanished, leaving him face to face with the debt he'd tried to outrun. Calls from lenders went unanswered until they couldn't be ignored. The story he'd told himself that one sale would fix everything finally collapsed under the weight of arithmetic. Walt didn't celebrate any of it. What he noticed instead was the neighborhood adjusting. Quietly, respectfully. Mrs. Gibbons stopped asking questions and brought over a loaf of bread one evening, setting it on the counter without commentary. The man at the cafe nodded differently now, no longer cautious but apologetic. The assisted living roomer died the way bad gossip always did without ceremony, starved of fuel once truth appeared. Hannah stayed another week. Together, they tightened the remaining seams of Walt's life. A mail hold at the post office, credit freezes with all 3 bureaus, identity monitoring activated and explained twice. Just to be sure, Hannah moved efficiently, methodically, like someone restoring order rather than responding to chaos. "This isn't fear," she said once, as they reviewed alerts on his phone. "This is maintenance." Walt nodded. He liked that framing. Denise stayed busy. Motions were filed to recover attorney fees, administrative costs, and damages tied directly to the attempted sale and filings. Everything was documented, everything traced. The lawsuit grew heavier, more difficult to dismiss as misunderstanding. "This isn't punitive," Denise told him. "It's corrective." That mattered to Walt. Caleb came by late one evening, unannounced but subdued, standing on the porch like a man waiting for weather to break. Walt let him in, not out of softness, but because avoidance wouldn't teach anything. "I messed up," Caleb said, voice low. "I know that now." Walt listened. "I didn't think it would go this far," Caleb continued. "I thought—" He stopped, breath hitching. "I need help." Walt studied his son's face. The fear was real. So was the regret. But regret wasn't accountability yet. "Help with what?" he asked. "Everything," Caleb said. "The debt. The mess. Sabrina?" He shook his head. "Please, have mercy." Walt didn't answer immediately. He felt the grief fully then, not sharp, not overwhelming. The steady ache of seeing where a path led, once it was already taken. "Mercy comes after truth," Walt said finally. "Not before." Caleb nodded, tears welling but contained. He didn't argue. That was new. After Caleb left, the house felt quiet in a different way. Not hollow, not tense, settled. Walt sat alone at the kitchen table, hands folded, breathing evenly. He felt grief. Yes, for the son he'd trusted, for the family he thought he had, for the ease that would never quite return. But alongside it was clarity, clean, sharp, and steady. The kind he hadn't felt in years. His name was intact. His home was his. The lies had been dragged into light where they couldn't pretend to be care anymore. Walt stood and turned off the kitchen light, the house settling around him as it always had. Whatever came next would be difficult, but it would be honest. Caleb made the offer through Denise, not directly. Walt learned that before he heard the substance of it, and that detail mattered more than Caleb probably realized. Even now, with consequences closing in, his son was still looking for angles. Denise laid it out during a quiet afternoon meeting. "He's willing to cooperate," she said. "Testify regarding Sabrina's role, the LLC, the filings, the credit attempts." Walt said nothing at first. He stared out the window at the line of trees along the parking lot, their leaves barely moving in the heat. Cooperation sounded responsible, but the timing told a different story. "He wants leniency," Walt said. "Yes," Denise replied. "Reduced exposure." Walt felt two emotions collide, disgust and pity, sharp and heavy at the same time. Caleb was still trying to trade information for relief, still looking for a shortcut out of a mess he'd helped create. It was familiar, painfully so. "He didn't protect me when it mattered," Walt said quietly. "But now he wants protection." Denise nodded. "That's why you set terms." She didn't sugarcoat them. Accountability meant structure, mandatory therapy, documented and ongoing. A formal repay meant plan tied to income, not promises. Legal stipulations barring Caleb from any involvement in Walt's finances or property permanent, enforceable, non-negotiable. "This isn't punishment," Denise said. "It's containment." Walt absorbed that. Containment wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. "Put it in writing," he said. Caleb came to sign 2 days later. He looked exhausted. The confidence that once filled his posture now replaced by something hollow. He sat across from Denise's desk and read every page slower than Walt expected. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said once, not looking up. "Yes," Walt replied. "You do." Caleb swallowed and kept reading. When he finished, his hands shook as he picked up the pen. He hesitated, just long enough to suggest he was hoping someone would stop him. No one did. He signed. The sound of pen against paper felt louder than it should have. Final. Binding. A door closing behind him that couldn't be reopened with charm or excuses. As they stood to leave, Caleb looked at Walt, eyes glassy. "I didn't think it would end like this." Walt met his gaze. "Neither did I." That night, the call came from Nora, an old family friend. Sabrina trusted enough to use as a bridge. Her voice was tentative, rehearsed. "Sabrina wanted me to reach out," Nora said. "She says she's misunderstood, that things got out of hand." Walt closed his eyes briefly. Even now, Sabrina wasn't speaking for herself. Still framing, still filtering. "If she has something to say," Walt replied evenly, "she can say it in court." Nora didn't argue. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Caleb found out the next morning. He came by unannounced, standing in the driveway like someone unsure whether he was welcome anywhere. "She's furious," he said. "She says you're turning everyone against her." Walt nodded once. "She did that herself." Caleb stared at the ground. "She might leave," he said. "Or I might." The words carried no self-pity this time, just recognition. "You may lose your marriage," Walt said. Caleb looked up, eyes rimmed red. "I know." "And you know why," Walt added. Caleb nodded slowly. "Because I chose myself over you." Walt felt the weight of that admission settle between them. It didn't erase what had happened, but it named it. "I deserve this," Caleb said quietly. Walt didn't correct him. Some realizations needed to stand on their own. As Caleb walked away, shoulders slumped but steps steady, Walt felt the familiar ache of grief, but it was different now. Cleaner. No longer tangled with denial or hope for an easy repair. His son had made his choice. Not just in cooperating, but in finally accepting consequence without deflection. Walt went back inside and closed the door. The house quiet around him. For the first time since this began, he knew exactly where everyone stood. And that clarity, hard-earned and unforgiving, was its own kind of peace. The mornings returned first. Walt noticed it one day when he realized he hadn't checked his phone in over an hour. Coffee steamed on the counter. The radio murmured low, and sunlight crept across the kitchen tile the way it always had. No alerts, no calls, no new damage to assess. Just the familiar quiet he'd almost forgotten how to trust. He went back to his routines, deliberately. Coffee measured, not rushed. Yard work done before the heat climbed too high. He trimmed the lantana carefully, fingers brushing the leaves. Ruth had once insisted made the place feel alive. The house responded the way houses do when they're respected. No creaks of tension, no sense of intrusion. It stayed still. Hannah stayed another few days, long enough to see the rhythm settle. She packed slowly, double-checking locks that didn't need it, hovering in doorways with questions she didn't voice. "You don't have to stay," Walt told her gently. "I know," she said. "I just like seeing it quiet." They hugged before she left, the kind of embrace that carried both relief and vigilance. She wasn't naive enough to believe everything ended cleanly, but she was reassured enough to let distance return. After she drove away, Walt installed the safe. Small, discreet, bolted into a corner of the closet where it didn't announce itself. Inside went the documents that mattered most: deed, trust paperwork, certified copies of everything that had nearly been used against him. He updated the trust again, slower this time, naming successor trustees with clarity that left no room for interpretation. "No ambiguity," Denise had said. "That's the point," Walt replied. Denise called the following week with confirmation. The title was officially clean. The forged documents were voided, flagged, and sealed into record as invalid attempts. No loose ends, no quiet reversals waiting to surprise him later. "It's done," she said. Walt thanked her and meant it. When the call ended, he sat for a moment longer than necessary, letting the finality settle without rushing past it. He made a donation that afternoon to a local legal aid organization that helped seniors targeted by fraud. He didn't announce it, didn't attach a story. He just gave quietly, understanding now how easily dignity could be mistaken for vulnerability. The letter arrived 2 days later, plain envelope. Careful handwriting. From the buyer. Walt opened it at the kitchen table and read it once, then again. The couple apologized for being pulled into something they hadn't understood. They thanked him for his patience and wished him well in his home. There was no request, no justification, just acknowledgement. Walt folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt seen. That night, he sat alone in the living room. Lights low, the house settling into itself. He thought about the word people like to use for stories like his. Revenge, justice, comeuppance. None of them fit. He hadn't taken anything from anyone. He hadn't lashed out or humiliated anyone for sport. He hadn't raised his voice to be heard. What he'd done was reclaim his name, the R in the middle, the authority to decide, the right to exist, without being edited out of his own life. The house stayed quiet around him, not tense, not fragile, just steady. Walt stood, turned off the light, and walked down the hallway, the floor familiar beneath his feet. Tomorrow would be another morning. Coffee, yard work, paperwork locked where it belonged. No one would ask him if he was moving. And if they did, he knew exactly how to answer. Caleb chose the diner because it was neutral and because it smelled like mornings that couldn't be edited. Burnt coffee, grease that never quite left the air, vinyl booths worn smooth by people who came to tell the truth when they ran out of better places to hide. He was already there when Walt arrived, sitting alone in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched. No Sabrina, no buffer. That, at least, mattered. Hannah sat at the counter near the window, close enough to see them but far enough not to intrude. Walt noticed that too. Caleb had asked for privacy, but not secrecy. They didn't shake hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb exhaled, shoulders sagging, like he'd been holding himself upright on borrowed strength. "I need to say this without spinning it," Caleb said. "So I'm just going to say it." Walt nodded once. He didn't encourage. He waited. "I resented you," Caleb continued. "Your house, your stability, the fact that you built something that didn't wobble every time life leaned on it." His voice tightened. "I never built that. I just kept trying to borrow it." Walt listened, face unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. Comfort would have been a lie at this point. "I told myself I deserved a piece of it," Caleb said. "That you wouldn't miss it. That you'd never really say no." He swallowed. "And when you didn't notice right away, I convinced myself that meant I was right." Walt took a slow sip of coffee. The bitterness grounded him. "Keep going," he said. Caleb nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "I didn't stop her, Sabrina. I didn't ask questions because I wanted the outcome." He looked up then, eyes red but steady. "That's the truth." Walt let the words land fully before responding. "Thank you," he said. Not warmly, precisely. Caleb slid a folded paper across the table. "This is a repayment plan, based on what I actually make, not what I wish I made." He paused. "And I'll comply with whatever the court orders. Therapy, monitoring, all of it." Walt unfolded the paper and read it carefully. Numbers, dates, no exaggeration, no miracles promised. "This doesn't fix everything," Walt said. "I know," Caleb replied. "It costs something. It's supposed to." Walt folded the paper again and set it aside. "Here are the boundaries," he said calmly. "No keys, no access to my mail, no paperwork, no accounts, no help, unless I ask for it. And if I say no, it stays no." Caleb nodded immediately. "Understood." "And if you cross that line again," Walt added, "I won't protect you from the consequences." "I know," Caleb said. "I wouldn't deserve it." From the counter, Hannah watched the exchange, hands wrapped around her own mug. She'd expected excuses. She'd expected manipulation. What she saw instead wasn't redemption, but accountability. Limited. Uncomfortable. Real. When Walt stood to leave, Caleb didn't follow. He stayed seated, eyes down, accepting the shape of the moment without reaching for more. Outside, the air was cool and dry. Walt paused beside Hannah. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said, surprised to find it true. They walked to the car together. Walt felt lighter, not because forgiveness had been granted, but because illusion had been removed. He wasn't carrying hope that lied to him anymore. Behind them, the diner hummed on, indifferent and honest. For the first time in a long while, Walt wasn't bracing for the next deception. He was simply walking forward, unburdened by the need to be fooled again. Weeks passed before Elliott Park called again, long enough for the urgency to drain out of everything and leave only resolution behind. Walt was in the backyard, trimming along the fence line when his phone rang. This time, the number was familiar. "Mr. Mercer," Elliott said, sounding lighter than Walt remembered. "I wanted to confirm personally the listing is officially withdrawn and permanently flagged. No one can touch it without triggering a full review." Walt rested the trimmer against the fence and wiped his hands on a rag. "Good," he said. "I'm sorry it took getting that far," Elliott added. "But I wanted you to know everything tied to that authorization has been marked fraudulent. Your file's clean." "Thank you for calling," Walt replied. There was a pause. Then Elliott exhaled softly. "Can I say something off the record?" "You already are," Walt said. Elliott chuckled once, then grew serious again. "Most people would have screamed, threatened lawsuits on the first call. You stayed calm." "Screaming doesn't fix signatures," Walt said. Elliott laughed quietly, the tension finally gone. "No, sir, it doesn't." He wished Walt well and ended the call. Inside, Walt sat at the kitchen table with the latest county records laid out in front of him. The corrected filing was crisp and final. Walter R. Mercer. Every letter where it belonged. No stray initials. No ambiguity. He ran his finger once along the printed name, not out of sentiment but confirmation. This was how systems closed cleanly when handled correctly. Hannah arrived later that afternoon with her suitcase, ready to fly home. She checked the locks out of habit, then stopped herself and smiled. "You're good," she said. "I know you are," Walt nodded. "So are you." They hugged at the doorway, longer than either of them expected. Pride sat alongside caution in her expression, earned, not naive. "Call me if anything even smells off," she said. "I will," Walt replied. And he meant it. After she left, the house returned to its settled quiet. Walt gathered his documents one last time, deed, trust, paperwork, certified copies, correspondence, and slid them into the folder he'd labeled years ago. He placed it in the small safe in the closet and turned the key once, firmly. Not fear. Order. He stood there a moment longer, hand resting on the safe, thinking about how close he'd come to being erased with paper and assumption. How easily a life could be rewritten if no one bothered to read carefully. Back at the table, he looked once more at the county record, then folded it neatly and added it to the file. Walt smiled just once and murmured to the empty room, "Read it again slowly," because now he knew exactly who had tried to erase him and exactly how to make sure they never could again.